Welcome to the Show Don't Tell Writing Podcast with me, Susie Vidori, where I peel back the layers of how to wow your readers with your fiction, your nonfiction. Anybody can bang out a first draft, but it takes a little more work to make your book as amazing as it can be. Join me as I share the step-by-step writing techniques you could apply to your writing right away, as I host successful writers who share a behind-the-scenes look at their own writing lives, and as I live coach writers on their pages, giving practical writing examples that will make your own writing stronger. Nobody is born knowing how to write an engaging book. There are real and important skills that you need to learn. On this show, I cut through the noise and get you all the info you need. I can't wait to see how this information is going to transform your writing. Today on the Show Don't Tell Writing podcast, we have a special reappearance of a guest, Samantha Cameron, who has been on the show before. But when we were talking before, we started to get into this discussion on brain chemistry. And as you know, I'm absolutely obsessed with how reading works in the brain and how your words can play out in readers' brains and how that can all work and how you can affect them. And Sam has a unique perspective because she was a former high school English teacher and has a lot of information on how teen brains work. And so we started talking about how the young adult books need to be different in order to appeal to teen brains. But conversely, in this episode that we decided to do an episode, of course, because you need this information as well, and we wanted to geek out and have this conversation. But more than that, knowing what needs to be different about teen brains can also help you with what is different about adult brains. So regardless of your genre, we'll talk about this a lot in this episode today. Regardless of your genre, take a listen. This is going to be super interesting. Welcome back to the podcast, Sam Cameron, who is a book coach and developmental editor, helping frustrated authors find clarity and fall in love with their stories again. She specializes in helping writers revise complete manuscripts so that they can turn rejections into requests. She's the creator of the weekly Substack Truant Pen, where she shares actionable advice for stuck writers. Okay, welcome back to the podcast, Sam Cam. I'm so excited to talk about this topic today.
I'm so excited to be back. I had so much fun last time.
Yeah, and this topic came about, as I said in the introduction, it kind of came about after we recorded the last one. We kind of touched on this, and I think it's a really important one for you to hear. So before you tune out, if you are not a young adult writer, I want to say we're going to talk about brain chemistry in young people and also how it's different. So even if you write for adults or whatever age category you write for, listen to this because it's important. And as well, we're going to talk about crossover. We're going to talk about all kinds of things. So don't miss this one. Okay. I just want to start off by saying to our listeners, first, when we say writing for young people, really, which is what it's about, what do we mean? What are the ages? Like, what is this young people? What are we talking about?
I'm glad we're starting this way because if you just say teen or young people, I think folks have lots of different ideas about what that means, because I've had people come to me and say they're writing for young adults. And what they mean by that is someone who's in their 20s.
Yeah.
But that's not actually what the industry means when they say young adult. And it's also kind of different from the psychological definition of adolescent and teen. So to clarify what I'm talking about, when I talk about teens or adolescents, I'm referring to roughly to people who are between the ages of 10 and 20, which is a pretty large age group. Within that age group, folks who are in these ages are undergoing an enormous amount of development, physical and cognitive development. It is the largest period of development that we undergo anytime except for when we're toddlers. It's just that people don't think it's as cute when you're a teenager as when you're a toddler.
No, my teenagers are pretty cute. They push back, but I think it's kind of cute too. And sometimes I laugh. They don't really appreciate that, but you gotta think some of this is cute. But yeah,
I think there's a lot of amazing things about teen brains.
And that's a huge range, like 10 to 20. So we're going to talk about the brain development and what it means for your writing and how to appeal to these people. But actually, that spans a ton of different categories.
Yeah,
in terms of what publishing says are the categories. I can run through them or you can run through them, but let's just state this because it's a hard thing to find that
Yeah.
publishing actually states the category based on the age of the protagonist, which is weird, and sort of the age of the reader as well. Do you want to
Yeah.
elaborate on that? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll elaborate on that. So that age range that I gave, that 10 to 20 age range, there's 3, maybe 4 different publishing categories that span that. So the first one we're going to hit is middle grade, or sometimes abbreviated as MG. And that's broadly speaking for characters or readers who are ages 8 to 13. So mostly these days, you're not going to see something marketed as middle grade that has a protagonist that's older than 13. Really
Yeah.
older.
Can you talk about that? Because there's a reason for that. Because
Yeah.
readers won't read about younger kids. They don't want to. They're not
Yeah.
interested. They're too cool. Right?
Yeah, for the most part. Yeah, absolutely. So what's interesting though is when I was a kid, you could find middle grade novels where the main characters were older teenagers or where the main characters were adults. So I'm thinking, for example, of like Ella Enchanted was my favorite middle grade novel when I was a kid. Once Upon a Marigold. These are all books that are middle grade by definition. That's clearly who they're written for. But the protagonists in all those books are older teenagers or adults. And that you don't see anymore. It is incredibly rare, if not unheard of, to find a middle grade novel with an older teen or an adult main character.
Yeah.
Does that
Okay.
match what you see, Susie?
Yeah, it definitely does. And I love that you said 8 to 13 because typically we see it listed as 9 to 12. And then when we talk about the next, but it isn't because there's sort of this 9 to 12. And then I'm going to steal a bit of thunder because I want to move on. But the young adult category is sort of 14 plus. And the issue is, listen to that for a second. We have 9 to 12 and then we have 14 plus. Well, who's writing that gap? I write that gap for that reader, and it's hard because there's no shelf. And so I have this huge marketing lift to do to reach that category of readers that I think is so important. Those on the cusp teenagers who actually want to read higher content or they have a higher reading level, avid readers, but so middle grade doesn't work for them from a reading level perspective, but they're not quite ready to read some of the racy stuff in YA that's for 17s, you know? So, okay, so then there's YA, right? Which I say 14 plus, but there's lower YA, which is sort of for 13, 14. And then there's upper YA, which is like 16 plus, which can include lots of other content. And then you said, because we're saying 10 to 20, there is this other, and I love that you say kind of half category. Do you want to talk a little bit about that for the 18 plus year olds?
So there is a publishing category that appears and disappears periodically. It's in and out of favor. At the moment, it seems to be having a little bit of a return to popularity.
Very cool. Very cool.
Which is the new adult category. And so that is very, very similar to YA, but it is a little bit longer. It can be a little more explicit sexually and violently speaking. And it is for people in that sort of 18, 19, 20 category of you've left high school, you've graduated high school, you're going to college, you're starting your first job.
Yeah. So for those of you who write for adults, this category for 10 to 20 is still important because,
well, teenagers read all sorts of things, right? Just like adults read all sorts of things. So if you are writing for adults, you may still capture the interest and attention of teen readers. And I saw this as a high school teacher, that there's lots of teens who like both YA and adult. There's teens who only want to read adult. There's adult books that are regularly popular with teens, like Dune and Game of Thrones, are wildly popular with teenagers, even though they were not written with that audience in mind.
Yeah. And so that's the dream, right? So this is why you need to keep listening to this podcast, because the dream is that everybody everywhere will find your book. And I hear this a lot from writers that, oh, I want my book to appeal to everybody. And I mean, there's the old marketing adage, if you're speaking to everybody, you're speaking to no one, right? So the thing is, the trick is, how do you write in your category with the genre expectations in your category, yet still leave the door open to appeal to a broader audience? And so that's what we're going to talk about some things today. Some of these tips and tricks might be the key to getting that big crossover. Okay, I just love that you're on the podcast. So this is how it started. I'm a parent of 3 teenagers, one soon to pass over that 20-year-old mark in a couple of months, but still a teenager. I'm going to take it for now.
And there's this whole concept of generations, right? So I'm Gen X. And when I say
Mhm.
Gen X, so a lot of my listeners are Generation X. I don't know the specific things. I don't have the dates in front of me, but you probably know if you are. And that means I was a latchkey kid who, was home alone a lot, did my own thing, and I read a lot because I didn't have a lot of technology. And so when we're writing as adults for other categories, sometimes we're a little bit blind to the differences, which is why this is really important. Do you want to talk a little bit about, because now these categories of generations are getting much smaller. They don't span 20 or 30 years anymore because of technology and changes.
Mhm.
What do you see, like, as a former high school teacher? How does that change? Like millennials and Gen Z, and I don't even know. I think my daughter's right on the cusp of whatever the next one is.
Yeah, so I think you're right that technology plays a very big role in how teens come to reading and experience reading in a different way. So, for example, I'm a millennial. I'm what would be called peak millennial, in that I was like the largest couple of years of when millennials were born. And we were born in a time when basically we spanned an enormous amount of change, right? We were born into an analog world. And then by the time we graduated high school, people had smartphones. And
But
so
did you have a smartphone? Probably
I
not.
didn't.
Some
Smartphones
people
were new.
did,
Yeah.
but now it's really like
But now it's
everybody, right?
ubiquitous, right?
Yeah.
So that's one thing, right? Is that the type of technology that's available, changes how kids interact with books and how much time
Or
they'll spend with, because
don't.
like education, like the expectations of what kids are supposed to do. Like I think kids today are way busier than either of us probably were as teenagers, right? So as teens used to have a lot more time, I think, for leisure reading than they do now. They're much busier. There's
Yeah,
like
my
higher
kids travel
expectations.
and play sports and like do all kinds of things and are busy all the time. And if they're not busy, then they're making plans, right? And they can
Yeah.
make quick plans.
And so there's elements that change. And then there's also things like culturally what's going on, and that will impact like when millennials really liked a lot of very dark, dystopian fiction. I don't think the current generation is as interested in that because their world is
They've
pretty
lived
dark.
it.
They've lived it. So there's things like that change. And then what's interesting is that there's some like brain chemistry things that are just, standard brain chemistry things. But because the technology has changed, the way those brain chemistry things are activated kind of differs. So an
Okay, let's talk
example,
about that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So an example I can think of is teenagers have a lower baseline level of dopamine in their brains than
Do you
adults
want
and
to,
younger
okay, do
children.
you want to back up and explain that whole
Oh
thing?
yeah.
Because I know what you're talking about. I'm, dopamine chaser here. But our list that might be new to our listeners. So let's talk
Yeah.
about it.
So dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's one of those chemicals in your brain, and it basically floods you with good feelings to reward you for doing things that are going to help you survive. So it's part of our survival mechanism. So you get flooded with dopamine when you eat carbohydrates because we need them to survive.
Yeah.
You get flooded with dopamine when you socialize because we're social animals. And you also get flooded with dopamine when you are reading something really good, because reading is also a survival thing, right? Storytelling is a survival thing. It's how we learn. It's how we, by kind of getting the chance to see what it's like in somebody else's experience. And this is where show don't tell becomes so important, right? Because you're
Yes. You're on the
bringing
Show Don't
someone
Tell podcast.
into your experience. Um, we want that, and we get dopamine for that because, again, we're social animals. So we need to know how to interact in society, and books help us to do that. So teenagers have this like lower baseline level of dopamine in their brains. And what that means is that they're very easily bored because they're not getting as much of that good feeling. So I don't know if you noticed this with your kids, Susie, but it can happen that
Oh yeah.
kids who like maybe they used to really like something and whatever it was, like now it's really boring or they're just like bored all the time.
Yeah. Now, yeah. And I see this, they kind of turn into somebody different for a few of a sudden.
Yeah.
But one coming out of it, and one already out of it, and one just entering. So it's totally true. Like things that they used to love doing, skipping down the sidewalk with me is no longer cool or whatever. There's
Yeah.
there's other things, but also to get them to engage is difficult during that stage because they're okay just laying on their bed looking at their phone, and they
Yeah.
really don't need you to
Well,
organize things as they
Yeah,
did
so
when they were
here's-
younger, right?
Here's where the technology comes in, right? So we know that our devices give us a hit of dopamine, right? That's what all the social media apps are designed to do. So that makes social media for a lot of reasons, but one of them is the dopamine, the lower level of dopamine. That's what makes it so appealing to teenagers. But also the low dopamine makes teens more susceptible to anxiety and depression. And so all of the problems that, we've been talking about within our societies about should teens be allowed on social media, what should we do about access to these technologies, are because in anyone, we know that these technologies can cause depression and anxiety, right? Or exacerbate depression and anxiety. And because of their natural brain chemistry, teens are more susceptible to those things. So,
And I think, yeah, and I just want to add to that because I think at late stages of, social media, I mean, I'm on social media. I met many of my listeners on social media, but it's changing rapidly because of AI and other factors. And because those companies are struggling to remain relevant, remain profitable, all these things, where you're the product on social media right now. And actually, I'm really proud. I live in Canada, and Canada just passed something. Who knows? By the time this airs, it may already be struck down or it may already be in place. I don't know. But they just passed something this week saying that they are going to outlaw social media under 16. Now, I don't know how they're going to do that because my kids would just change their birth date. There's ways around it. I mean, we're pretty strict in our household, I gotta say, like, because before I get all this hate mail or advice on parenting, we are very strict and we have very open communication about social media in our household. And my kids were old when they got it. And we're kind of like, my youngest still doesn't have data. Like, we're just kind of stingy about it. And we do monitor it. And when they were younger, especially, they weren't allowed phones in their rooms and they weren't allowed this and that. And in elementary school, they had one phone between the three of them because they needed a phone. They were walking from the bus stop by themselves and they were home with a young babysitter, like a teenage babysitter at that time. So we wanted them to have a phone when I was working in corporate and I wasn't home when they got home from school. And so, yeah, they had this one phone. And
ways. It's not, I mean, it's a work in progress. And so we're not doing things perfectly, but in general, kids these days have a lot of competition. They're not reading as often, right?
yeah.
Okay. So what is about, because they'll lower dopamine. That's actually really interesting. I didn't know that. What else about teen brain chemistry is interesting as it relates to reading?
Okay, so we talked about the lower dopamine. The other thing that's really fascinating paired with the lower dopamine is that teen brains are what neuroscientists would call highly plastic. So plasticity in neuroscience means like how adaptable your brain is, like how able you are to learn new things. And teen brains are highly plastic. And so this makes sense if you think about it, right? Like what your teen is up to on a daily basis. They're like learning calculus and Spanish and how to drive and world history and like all these things at once. And it would be way too much for an adult brain to actually take all of that in and absorb it. It would take us a lot longer for sure. And so that combination of the fact that you have the low dopamine, right? And so teens are bored because of that, but also their brains are highly plastic. They have this natural, intense curiosity that makes them really want new things, right? To have new experiences and to find new things. So that actually makes reading appealing to teenagers, right? To those who enjoy reading, right? It makes watching television, it makes socializing, it makes all these things more appealing to them. It actually makes school appealing, right? If they are lucky enough to be in a school environment where they have teachers and courses that pique their curiosity, they are naturally primed to want to learn new things because it fills that gap, that natural gap.
And when I look at my middle schooler, they have 7 or 8 periods in one day.
Mhm.
For a different subject. I'm like, and then my high school, they got 4, right? Because it kind of changes, I think, their ability to context in that way or what they like, how deep they need to go on.
So what? So the low dopamine, the other thing that it does is it makes their emotions very powerful, teen emotions very powerful. So folks probably remember this from their own adolescence, that especially new emotions like a first crush are like very, very intense compared to like other times of life. And so teens are really looking for an outlet for those very intense emotions. And so books again can kind of provide that for them. So again, the value of
Like
show
a
don't tell.
validate their experience, right? Or
Yeah.
their experience, or help them process their feelings about in their lives. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So like a teen who is having a very intense crush, they may not be able to actually do anything about that very intense crush in real life, but they can read like a love story or like a very intense romance and like have an outlet for those feelings, right? Or a teen could be extremely angry about just everything, right? And how unfair everything feels. And they maybe can't do anything about that in their real life, but they could read something like Red Rising or one of those like big angry rebellion books and have an outlet for that anger, right? In something like
Because
that.
after reading and getting the dopamine and getting all the other things, they're also processing, right? We're
Right.
processing their own feelings and putting themselves in that situation and kind of working through so that it doesn't feel so big and scary. I mean, when you read something that's way bigger than what your own experience has been, or way more traumatic, or way, deeper, or whatever it is, I know, I don't know if I assume it's a brain chemistry thing. I don't know. I thought about it, but sometimes reactions in teenagers over small things can be really big, right? They lose
Mhm.
control or blow things out of proportion, as it will. Okay, so what does this mean in terms of, from a reading standpoint, what does this mean in terms of their focus, in terms of what topics they're interested in, or the feelings or big questions that they might be exploring? What can we learn as writers about this particular moment in time and what they might be looking for? You mentioned a couple that they're looking to explore feelings about crushes or anger or these things, but anything else that you want to add? What can we learn about it?
Yeah, so I have three ideas that I want to talk about. And the first two will be useful for writers of any age group, right? So if you're writing adult, these first two tips will still be useful to you. And then the third one is more specifically about if you are wanting to write for the YA or middle grade markets. So the first thing is to be as I'm what's the word I'm looking for? Concise. You want to be concise, right? And tight with your writing in terms of making sure that you don't have like meandering plots. Yeah, that you don't have all these tangents that don't go anywhere. And this is something that will appeal to a lot of adult readers as well, because a lot of adults' spans have also shortened as a
Yeah,
result
I was
of.
going to say, I think that's changed over time. And that's something that a lot of writers, especially if you're, with many from the boomer generation and from my generation, from Gen X generation, and we grew up reading much slower books where the pacing is different, and you just can't get away with that now. It doesn't stand up in the marketplace, right? It's not what people are wanting.
Yeah. Like, I mean, if you go to the bookstore and you see Priory of the Orange Tree, don't think you can get away with writing a fantasy novel that long. That's rare, right? That one that someone's going to buy that. And the author whose name I'm forgetting, it's Samantha something. She is an established author before she wrote that book. Like, that was not her debut. Yeah. So shorter books, or at the very least, like very tight pacing of, moving from one thing to the next very quickly, especially at the beginning. The second is lots of interiority on the page. Now, this might seem contradictory to what I just said, because interiority, that place where you show how the character is feeling and how they're processing and making meaning. Yeah, so those inner thoughts, like they can, on the one hand, they seem like they might slow down the story, right? And so if you're like, wait, Sam, you just told me to cut my word count and, everything like that, I wouldn't do it at the expense of the interiority, because the interiority is where the emotion is coming from, and it's what makes it's what makes the book appealing, not just to teen readers, but to readers of all
Well,
ages.
honestly, when I talk with readers and when I look at the way that books have changed in the last 30 years, I mean, or 40 years, if I'm being honest, how long I've been reading, 45 years, that switch to interiority or deep perspective is one of the biggest shifts. And if you're coming to them having read a lot of books that are 25 or 30 years old as your inspiration, you mentioned Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings, or, you're comparing yourselves to these epic big books that would probably never get published today, unfortunately. It's because of this switch or this ability to immerse in that deep discover with interiority, which is one of the only things, the advantages that we have over film or other mediums, even by being, because they don't have that ability to be inside somebody's head. And you'll see that shift technically in more recent books, in that something like omniscience, where you're or a third person that is close third person, is rare today. And you have to do it so well. And it has to be, there has to be a reason for it. You have to be over the top well to be accepted in publishing. Third person close and or first person is by far more popular in most genres, because we can do this inferiority thing, which is really difficult to do well in those other. So I just wanted to point out, technically there's been a shift because of this, because of what people are demanding. And because we have access to, I can go and do virtual reality or many, many immersive technologies that allow me or raise my expectations.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's telling that to me, the novels that I see continue to be popular with teen audiences. So I brought up that Dune and Game of Thrones continue to be popular. Yeah. And partly that's because kids were drawn to them from the movies and the television show. But then they actually read the books and they like the books. And I think both of those series do have, pretty deep interiority, even for the time that they came out. And that's part of why they're still appealing. So anyway, so those are my two, if you want to write for something that will appeal to anyone and that would also get you the teen readers, is the deep interiority and the kind of tighter plots. And then the other question you asked about was what appeals, what types of stories appeal to teen readers. So this is more of a thing to consider if you are aiming specifically for middle grade or YA and those kinds of sweet spots. So middle grade, so that's that kind of 8 to 12, 9 to 12 age group. Those books, though, the sort of phase of life that kids are in there, these are kids who are starting to get a little bit of independence, and they're starting to figure out who they want to be in the world. So they're thinking about their interactions with their friends, doing the right thing, when they're faced with
they're still part of a family unit too.
Yeah.
And they see themselves as part of a family unit. They're trying to break out that, right? Yes, it's always the family unit. But then we get to the next category, and then there's other sets of topics, right?
Yeah. So then at the YA side, that's the age at which kids are really thinking about autonomy and independence, right? Like you said, kind of breaking free of the family unit. This is where, the age at which, yes.
This is why, we don't have to kill them. That's the joke.
Yeah.
If you look at every Disney princess, her mother is dead. Sorry to be crass, but this is true. And we don't really think about it. We just accept it. So find a way to get rid of the parental figures, or at least make them so useless that they're not going to spring in the way that I might and save my kids.
Yes.
Hey, yeah, you know what? That person's lying to you. True. Or have those parental figures or teacher figures or whatever they are that they can actually rely on.
Yes.
Because it's
you need to give the kids agency, whether it's middle grade or YA, right? Your child protagonists need to have agency. You can't give the agency to an adult, even if it feels quote unquote more realistic, because the point is that these are kids. The kids who are reading this want to see themselves in the driver's seat. So Susie, did say kill off the parents, and that's why so many YA books are about orphans, right? Or middle grade books are about orphans. But there are some examples of books I can think of where the parents are present and they're supportive even, but the plot is structured in such a way that
they can't for some reason.
They can't intervene. So the two examples that pop to the top of my head are Date Me Bryson Keller by Kevin Van Wy. And in this book, the main character is closeted and he's not sure how his parents are going to react when they find out that he's gay. And the plot kind of revolves around him sort of secretly dating this other boy who's also closeted. So he can't talk to his parents or any of the adults about what's going on in the plot because he's worried about how they're going to respond when they find out.
Well, right. So when I say kill the parents, you don't have to literally kill them, but you have to create a barrier so that whatever that real or imagined, right?
Yeah.
In that case. Okay. So that's sort of the topic. That is amazing. So, okay, well, what can we do technically to attract these younger readers in terms of what emotional depth can they handle? Or we kind of touched on this. What about dark? Like, what can middle grade YA readers or that age group reader, what can they handle? Because that question comes up a lot, or sexual explicitness, or politics, or religion, or death. I mean, I'm throwing a lot of these things out there, but this is a big question when people want to write a book that appeals to teenagers, whether they're writing for adults and they want it to be attractive or not. What does that look like? How do you make those decisions, and what are the rules, if any?
Okay, that's a really good question. So there's a huge amount of diversity among kids, just like there is among adults. And kids, for the most part, will kind of know what they are interested in, what they can handle in terms of, what they want to be reading about. So you're going to have some kids who are really craving the dark topics and who can handle them and want to read about them. And then you're going to have some kids who really don't want that and really can't handle it. So I think that it's important to provide, as creators, a variety of topics. And so if there is a kind of dark topic that you feel like is important and you have a story that you want to share about it for young readers, then go for it. We'll talk about some of the quote unquote boundaries in a second. But if if you're not someone who wants to write that, you don't have to, because there is a market for and readers who aren't looking for the darker stuff.
I think as long as you're clear on that, and like every genre, I mean, why can middle grade are not technically genres, they're age categories, right? Within that, there are lots of different genres and they all kind of get together on the same shelf. But there are thrillers and mysteries and romance, all of the things. And so the darkness level and the whatever, it really does depend on what type of book. And as long as you're clear on, and it's obvious from the get-go, you don't want to surprise the reader with
Right.
really dark twist 3/4 of the way through, because it's very discombobulating, especially for a younger reader. It can be very triggering. I know when I was trying to help my kids, choose books, The Hunger Games was a huge series, and the movies had just come out when my daughter, who's now turning 20, was probably 10 or 11. And so she came to me and said, I want to read The Hunger Games. And I'm not one for, and we can talk about this too, I don't try to censor books by any means, but I wanted her to understand what the book was about because I know my kids. And I said, hey, yeah, it's a really awesome book. I loved it. I said, but it's about kids being forced to kill other children. And I said, when I took your dad to the movie, he looked at me and said, I understand why you like it and why this is a really important movie, but please don't make you watch anymore. I'm gonna grow up. Like, it was just way too hard for him. And I told to my then 10 or 11-year-old, and she said, okay, well, I'm not ready to do that yet. Like, that feels sad. You're right. Now,
Yeah.
a year or two later, she's, yeah, I think I got this. And then she read it and she was like, woo, like crazy emotional, but like I was ready. And that was sort of, I didn't tell her, don't read the book. I own the book. It's on the shelf. Go ahead. But just so you know, like, do it in a space where you're going to be okay. And I'm here to talk about it if it becomes not okay. Right? Like,
Yeah.
helping them through that choice.
Yeah, which is, I think, a service that we all owe to any reader of any age, right? Is to be very clear up front what the emotional experience of the book is, so that people can choose whether they're on board for that experience or not. Like, I think there is a temptation first, like, because I've talked to some writers who are like, okay, well, if I include this and I have to put a content warning, is that going to turn people away? It's like, yes, it is going to turn people away, but it's going to turn people away who would not enjoy reading this book. And so that's good. You don't want to trick someone into reading a book that they're not actually going to like.
Yeah, and I think that's true no matter what you're writing. It's often writers always want to have this surprise twist. And if you're writing thriller or suspense, I mean, go listen to my other great colleague, Samantha Skull. We do an episode on that about twists and things. But if you're not writing something that needs to hide it, it's often not the right answer, because you could really surprise your reader. And that's true with fantasy books, where the first half of the book, there's no magic. And then all of a sudden there's magic in the second half of the book. We're breaking a contract here, right? We're going to attract the wrong reader. So the same thing is true with any of these deep topics, which, like you said, I mean, there's a place for these. And it's also the reason why a lot of readers read up or read adult topics, but don't be afraid to explore them in YA or in middle grades. And you were talking, okay, so you kind of mentioned boundaries. You threw out there that you wanted to talk about boundaries. What do you mean by that?
Okay, so in terms of boundaries, these are things that are not hard and fast rules, but they are the things that traditional publishers typically will stay away from, just because they're sort of the social mores and
Or controversial?
or controversies or whatever. So the biggest, clearest one is that there's a pretty hard line around anything sexually explicit for characters that are under the age of 18. Now, this does not mean that you can't have characters under the age of 18 having sex in your book. It just means that it's probably going to be fade to black or closed door. It's going to be not explicit if you're doing traditional publishing. So that's I would say, the biggest one.
Yes, not erotica for teens. Correct.
Yes. Teens read that stuff, but they read it in adult books. And I think it's very notable that A Court of Thorns and Roses, the main character is 19 years old, right? So we can get away with some very...
I was thinking of that, and that's a really, that's a really controversial series, or it isn't, but maybe should be. And when I used to do a lot of school visits, I would see that book on, grade 5 kids' desks because they're reading up. And I think because it's in the young adult section, their parents don't realize what's in the book.
Yes.
And again, I mean, I'm not for censoring or anything else, but I know, like, in the case of some of my colleagues or friends, they're like, oh, my kid is reading this and she's 11, right? And I'm saying, oh, cool. It's actually an amazing series, but just so you know, there is fairly explicit sex in it. And so, like, not erotica pieces. I said, so they're going to learn some new things, but just be aware, don't let them read it. And they're like, whoa, should I not let her read it? And I'm like, they're all reading it. So just like, be prepared to have the conversation and open the door to the conversation. And that's one where, again, not exactly a censor, but those books are also in my home. And when my daughter was, 14 and said, can I read these books? I said, they have this in it. And she's like, ew, I don't want to read that. So I was like, okay, well, when you're ready, and I'm sure she did read them eventually. Now she's 20, but she didn't ask me. So I'm sure they got read. During the pandemic, she ate books. I'm fortunate to have some really amazing colleagues who have worked with some huge publishers, and they brought over boxes of, like, arts and, like, cool stuff. And I remember, just one quick aside, because this is such a good story. It was during the pandemic, and she was in ninth grade, I think. And we had, like, this online Zoom meeting with her teacher who requested it, which is unusual. And we're sitting there and she's kind of wagging her finger and saying she's a good reader. And the things that she's bringing to school to read during reading period are not high level books. They're kind of middle grade or whatever, or really young, like lower YA, and she could be reading much more. And we were doing this Zoom meeting in this office, like, right, I was sitting right in this chair. And I said, oh, and I looked at my daughter and I said, what gives? And she said, we only read 10 minutes a day, and I don't want to leave that. Like, they were back in school, masked and all the things and distanced, but they were back in school. And she said, I don't want to leave my book there. And so I just bring a book that I can reread. She goes, but that's not what I'm actually reading. And I reached for this stack of books that was on my desk. I'm like, this is her actual reading list. And I was, like, showing the teacher these things. And she's like, that book isn't out yet. I'm like, no, it isn't. She's like, oh my God, I want to read what she's reading. But, like, yeah, it was this thing where she was actually hiding what she was reading because it wasn't, she didn't want to talk about it with other kids. She didn't want to show people that she had signed books. Pretty big authors. They weren't mine. They were from colleagues that had dropped them off to keep her entertained. But yeah, it's amazing, right? Like, what they end up reaching to read. Okay, so we're talking about the content and all of the things and the boundaries. Were there any other boundaries, or are we good?
So that's the only absolute like clear
Well, and I will
boundary.
say, yeah, and I will say, if you are writing YA and or middle grade and you want to be in the school system, then you have a different standard, because you may not
Yes, that's true.
be allowed to present in schools if you have certain content in your books. And it's just something to be aware of. It doesn't mean that you can't write them. It does mean that you may get banned, which
Yes.
might be a great thing, because you can feature that or you can rail against it. Maybe you're
Yeah.
doing
I
something
mean,
right.
so for example, like I write LGBTQ fiction.
Yeah.
And you were saying about how like A Court of Thorns and Roses is just like on shelves at, in the YA section in the school library
Yeah.
or whatever. And nobody
Totally
thinks twice
cast.
about it.
Nope.
And a way less explicit same-sex romance
so
would absolutely
frustrating.
be challenged. Yeah.
Yeah. So frustrating in terms of what
Yeah.
people's biases are. And the whole point of literature at that age is to expose people to different things.
Yes.
And actually, this is a topic I'm going to stumble through right here. But, there's this idea, and it's something that I coach a lot of writers on, and I'm sure you come across as well. When we are from a different generation and we don't have the language or things, bullying was different in terms of what was acceptable and things like that in our day. And it does still happen, but we try to model different things in books and not unintentionally reinforce negative stereotypes. We try to not sugarcoat the world, but we try not to give voice to some of those negative opinions. What's your experience been on that? Like, whatever the topic, right? There's things that are just, I had to tell a writer, writing middle grade this week, when she's using the word stupid. And I'm like, kids don't use that word anymore, right? Like we don't, not in the way that we did growing up. And you've got to adjust it because a publisher won't like it, right? Like, how do you talk to your writers about that?
Okay, so that's a really good question. So one of the things that I'm always on the lookout for is tropes, like problematic tropes that are now
Stereotypes, right?
Yeah, or stereotypes and things like that. So like the gay best friend stereotype, for example, like I was just working on a manuscript that had it, and I was like, okay. And I said, you can do this, but there's a lot of people who aren't going to like it, right? There's a lot of people who are going to find it to be kind of like stereotypical. So if it's important to you that your straight female character has a gay best friend, because like some straight women have gay male best friends, you just want to make sure this guy is like really well developed as a character, and that, you do something to subvert the trope. Like, what if he's married? Whereas like normally that stereotype is,
the single one that's always available.
Single all the time. Right.
Yeah.
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 So I would say that that's the main way in which that comes up in my work, is kind of identifying tropes that are now like, used to be really common, or like things that we now would say are stereotypical that we want to edit out. The other place I would say, you were talking about how we want to like model things that are like maybe not reality, but would be like a better version of reality. So like consent in relationships, you see this in romance novels, both, as well as in YA novels. So I was just thinking about, I always forget if it's Dark and Deepest Red or Deep and Darkest Red. I think it's Dark and Deepest Red by Anna Marie McLemore. It's a retelling of the Red Shoes, the fairy tale.
Yeah.
And there's a sex scene in the book. It's very not explicit, like very implied, but it's between two teenagers, and the author very specifically models healthy consent between these two teenagers, right? In a way that probably real teenagers don't yet know how to do, but it is not for those teenagers.
I hope my kids never listen to this
reading
episode because I'm sharing a lot. But my youngest came home this week and said, "Mom, we learned all about consent today in sex ed." And I was like, I said, "Oh yeah, how was that?" She's like, "I mean, how many times have we had this conversation?" Because it's something that we talk about very openly in terms of writing. And she's my one hope I have one hope for a reader and one hope for a writer. That's why. And then I have a child who's interested in neither. But yeah, so she's actually quite interested in that topic. And so I don't think she offered any advice or anything, I'll say it during that class, but she said, yeah, like all the things that you and I have talked about, things we learned today. So yeah, it's something that they're learning, but it's difficult to model for sure. Or for many of those teens in that classroom, it was probably the first time that they'd ever heard that topic talked about.
Right.
So modeling
like
that
if their parents don't want to talk to them about it or don't know how to talk to them about it, a book is a place where they can find it.
Yes. And for me, because I'm so aware of it because of the industry, it's definitely something I talk about with my girls. It's something I talk about even more with my son. It's really, really important to have that conversation, and to model that in books is amazing. Okay. So the bottom line is we do want to have, we talked about tropes or whatnot. We want to have diversity in our books, but we don't want to be modeling or inadvertently reinforcing negative stereotypes, but give them a role, right? We don't want to just stick something in there that, a diverse character that is unlike ourselves just to have them there or to check a box. We need to make sure that they are, that it's not just that they're a gay character, but that they actually make sense in terms of, yes, there are many, many gay people in the world, so they belong in your book. It doesn't mean you can't write it, right?
Yeah, there's a little test that it's called the Vito Russo test. It's kind of like the Bechdel test, and it's specifically for gay characters, but I think you can modify it in general for like approaching writing about marginalization. So the Vito Russo test is, do you have like identifiably explicitly gay characters?
Yeah.
So like Dumbledore doesn't count because he's not explicitly gay in the book. J.K. Rowling just said he was later.
Yeah.
Is the character important to the plot such that their removal alters the story? And the last one is, are they identifiable by features differentiable from other characters by features other than their marginalization?
Yeah.
So those are 3 good questions to ask yourself, and just like replace gay with, whatever type of marginalization you're working on or representation you're working on, right? So make sure that your characters are 3-dimensional, right? That they're not just identifiable by, well, this character's gay and that's how they're different from the main character.
Yeah, they're not a stock character, right?
Yeah. And that they actually matter to the story.
Okay. Well, this has been absolutely amazing. I'm sure we're going to talk about teen brains for many, many years, Calvi and I. But yeah, we're to the quick fire portion. You only get one quick fire question because I've asked you these questions before. But what is your best advice for writers listening today that want to pull in young people to their books?
Do some journaling about what it was like for you at that age and what mattered to you and what you cared about and what you wanted to see.
Yeah. Good advice. But then, and it's excellent advice. But if you are of my generation, you're going to need to temper that, right? To modernize it a little bit and appeal to them.
But some of the deep stuff will resonate still.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, universal truths are universal truths. Whether or not you had a landline a pink phone that you pulled down the hall in your bedroom with a really long cord, or whether you Snapchat your friends 80 times an hour, right? Like technology may have changed, but the resonance or the emotional resonance probably hasn't. Yeah. Amazing. Thank you so much, Sam, for coming on the podcast again today. This is amazing.
Thank you, Susie. It was great to be here.
Thanks for tuning in to the Show Don't Tell Writing Podcast with me, Susie Vidori. It is my absolute honor to bring you the straight goods for that book you're writing or the book that you're planning to write. Please help me keep the podcast going by helping people find us. You can subscribe to the podcast and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you're listening to show how much you enjoy the show. That's how other listeners will find us. Also, visit susievidori.com/newsletter to hop on my weekly inspired writing newsletter list, where you'll stay inspired and be the first to know about all the upcoming training events and writing courses that happen in my community. Want my eyes on your writing? Submit a page of your current draft for a chance to come on the podcast at the link in the show notes. I'd love to chat with you about your writing in my always positive, incredibly supportive way so that you can make great strides towards your writing goals. I'm here to cheer you on. Remember, that book you're writing is going to open doors that you haven't even thought of yet, and I can't wait to help you make that it the absolute best it can be. See you again right here next week. Hi, writer. Want my support to get your book finished and out into the world? Join my Inner Circle membership, a community of supportive writers where each month we set goals, share pages, learn new techniques, and get you unstuck fast so that you can make continuous progress on your writing goals. Coached Writers Finish. And you can get me as your virtual book coach in this group program for only $199 a month, much less than a single one-on-one coaching session. Check out the details at suziebedori.com/inner circle. We have live events happening all the time, so grab your spot now to join us.